So I appreciate it greatly, and I will suffer through the entire thing because that's what you do. But be warned, if throughout the whole course of this panel I slowly start getting more like,
You might like it by the end.
Okay, so everyone here?
that's what people say.
Alright, so, yeah, I'm not a big IPA drinker either. I drink my entire.
I love it. Yeah.
Do you want to
Yeah, I basically had to go gluten free.
That's fine. We have the answers. Alright, so it's 1 o'clock, so let's get this started.
Oh, we have to be official?
I guess.
Do you want more of the beer with that else? Yeah, it's like literally.
All the fucking name tags screams official to me, so I feel like
Get the moderator from that.
yeah.
It's like,
Be like from under the L. Okay, so welcome to world building for books and RPGs. I think that's what it is of the panel. Okay, cool. Let's introduce from far in there.
Hey, I'm Drew. If you missed the early meeting this morning, I'm the GM of the Authors and Dragons podcast, and I write books like Superpowers for the Vampire Count and the recently released 5-Minute Sherlock, The Case of the Damaged Detectives, and in October, my next book, Underqualified Advice and Other Amusing Diversions, should be out. That's going to be half advice, half random, rambling comedic entries. So it'll either do well or be a complete fucking shit show. We truly don't know. It's a wild experiment.
Right. I'm James Hunter. I was not on the introduction panel. I'm a fantasy author for the most part. I've written 25 books, I think. It's hard to track. Between the casual drinking. But all fantasy or some iteration of fantasy. I've done a bunch of urban fantasy stuff, kind of dark gray shoot 'em up stuff, and I also write more high fantasy stuff with game-lit elements for those who are familiar with like lit RPG. I write the Vertigate Online series and Rogue Dungeon, a bunch of other stuff. So that's me.
Since you gestured to me, I just want to be clear. There's only cat behind.
You're a committed alcoholic. I can see that now. So thank you for the
You
clarification.
gotta believe in yourself.
My name's JD Jordan. I write sci-fi and historical science fiction. I've got a sci-fi western for sale in the other room. There are only 4 copies left if you want one. That's your plug so that I can go to the pool this afternoon. I also have been DMing for a long time, currently running games in D&D 5th Edition and Star Wars Force and Destiny. Yeah, that's it.
That's it?
That's it.
Hi, I'm Rachel Carr. I write under R.E. Carr, and clearly I am a huge fan of IPAs, as you've been seeing. I write the Rules Undying series, which won the Kindle Scout in 2015, and now there's 6 books in my trilogy. And for some crazy reason, I wrote a book, now a series, with Rick Waltieri called False Icons, where Second String Savior is out. I'm out of copies, but he still has them. Because obviously people like me better.
Well, you're award-winning and he's not.
And it's been mentioned.
All right, and I'm the moderator. I'm Joseph Brassey. I'm a historically European martial arts instructor. I was an author on the Mongoliad books. My novels Skyfarer and Dragon Road are available for sale in the other room. And running out of copies fast, so get on that.
I have plenty of books, please. You can come by mine.
And I am George Garza on the Officer Dragons podcast, in case you missed the intro. And so to get started, one of the first questions I ask when talking to people about world building is, when you're starting out, when you're first beginning, what is your kernel? What is the thing that sparks what is your starting point for world building? What is the first question you ask? Go.
I start with the people in it. I tend to be very character focused, and usually I start with, well, this is a person. Okay, well, they have to work, they have to eat, they have to sleep, and I kind of expand outward in sort of a spiral. Every once in a while, I'll have something weird like, if vampires don't have reflections, how do they comb their hair? And that started a whole world. So sometimes it can be completely random, but usually I start with a person and work out.
Yeah, the same. I start with the character and then what's the situation? And then that nugget tends to produce all the things. and you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes once the world building starts spinning up, but it's always got to be relevant back to that character. Like, you can figure out how hyperdrive works or how magic works, but if that person is neither a wizard or an engineer, then I don't think it's, it may be relevant, but you don't have to tell the reader how it works.
But it's fun.
Yeah, it's fun for me to figure out, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have a good process for how I come up with stuff. Sometimes it's a character, and I'll have like a really clear vision of like, this is the character, and this is what this character can do, and this is the kind of wonky adventure I want to go on, and then I'll kind of invent a world around that character as they move through it and they go to a different place. I'm like, what fucking cool, crazy thing. So in my Lazarus series, in book 5, he goes to hell and he has to fight his way through Hellian roller derby girls who are like Frankenstein women built from pieces of other women, and they fight to the death in the second level of hell. So you can just like do fun things and you can invent fun places for your characters to go. But sometimes it's the opposite, and I'll start with a really cool story prompt and I'm like, okay, this is the story that I want to tell. What kind of character would be the best for that particular story? What would be a world that would be ideally situated to tell that story would have the greatest impact? And then sometimes it'll be the opposite. I'll just have this really cool image or a really cool idea of like, oh man, that would be the coolest magic thing that I could possibly do. What world could that exist in? And so I've written a lot of books, and so it kind of comes from all over the place. But to your point, I think especially on the world building stuff, it can be really easy as a new author to get lost down the world building disease rabbit hole where you're just building endlessly for no apparent reason. It does always have to sort of come back and reflect on the character, otherwise you're just like spinning your wheels just because you can and you're not really going anywhere.
We're spending 3 hours on Google. Like, how many calories does the average werewolf need to eat in a day? 10,000, by the way, for partial change, 23,000 for a full.
So mine can come from a lot of different starting points, depending on the series, honestly. Fred was one that started with Fred. That was a very character-driven one. But Superpowered started with a concept first. I was pre-2008, like pre the Marvel explosion, pre-superhero content of every flavor, fucking everywhere. I couldn't find anything that did the powers and the people, and that really annoyed me as a reader. And so when I finally decided to scratch that itch, it came from wanting those two things to run in parallel, human development and power development. And so college was a natural setting. Everything kind of grew out of that one, where it started as character focused. And I mean, Villain's Code honestly just started with an image in my head of a dude in a business suit, undoing a tie and punching the shit out of a monster. And that was Ivan. And that's sort of, it's weird, he didn't even end up being the main character, but that's where he started out. So it often comes from an idea that I want to explore. And sometimes that will be a short story, or shingles, or sometimes it'll be a full book, but ultimately the world that shapes around it for me is all about exploring that one interesting idea that drew me in enough to make me want to write it. And everything builds in service of that idea. So when the world is expanding, it's always, okay, because this is true, then this is true. It all has to flow from whatever makes this world unique. And that's part of why I like to say there's no such thing as genre, there's just settings. Especially if we're talking about urban fantasy and whatnot. You can do superhero and supernatural, like as long as things don't conflict with each other, it's completely fine. There's just, as long as you follow if-thens, as long as everything flows from the differences.
Okay, so that's sort of, this sort of leads dovetails actually like, so, oh right, I should probably ask my own. So for me, like a lot of the other people said, it usually starts with one thing, whether it's character, whether it's sort of a concept, or often one of the things that sparks for me is a dynamic, like a relationship dynamic specifically that sticks in my head, and then I start going, well, what sort of world would create this dynamic? What sort of surroundings would necessitate this dynamic? Or force it into being or whatever. So I guess the next kind of question, the kind of easy dovetail on that, is how do you flesh out? And how do you pick how much to flesh out? And I want to make sure we stay on games as well. Most of us are DMs. And how do you choose where to flesh out?
Start this time. So a big part of, especially like the fleshing out for gaming is assessing the group that you're DMing for. It's really like people skip it, but if you're DMing for a bunch of real crunchy, like deep in the numbers, they love to track every little thing, then you need to build a complex campaign in a world that reflects that. If you are DMing for people who are making all barbarians called the Fuck Shit Up Squad, maybe build a world that facilitates that having fun. Give them some other things to play against the No We Fuck Shit Up Squad and its fighters. So the tone in the world that kind of grows out, especially for gaming, should be reflective of the group. And to tie it to books, the world that grows out should be reflective of the tone of the book. If it's comedic, then it's okay to have a funnier world where things don't make as much sense. If it's more serious, then you should probably, give more earnest consideration to the systems and things that grow up around it. But as long as you're true to the tone, I think that's sort of my takeaway.
And on that point, because I think it's a good one, and it does translate well to books, knowing who your audience is, right? If you're writing, I don't write hard sci-fi because I don't have the mathematics or science background to write hard sci-fi, because people who like that, they like getting into the nitty-gritty of like how black holes work. I don't know. I would hand wave that away, and if I did that in a hard sci-fi book, those readers would be really angry about it. And I think that applies to fantasy as well, right? There are the people that fall into the Sanderson school of world building that want to know exactly how the mechanics of your magic work, and they want to know exactly, when you burn aluminum, what is that going to do, and how is that going to counteract with this? And they want all those details. They want it to feel like this is something that I could reasonably do if I was in that world. And then you have another, school of people that I kind of think of them as the Harry Potter school of people, that it's a lot more hand wavium is going on, right? And it's a much more loose magic system. So I think knowing your audience and kind of knowing what their expectations are helps you deliver the right kind of details that are going to be interesting and entertaining for them. I think especially if you're a new writer, you have to be careful with the world building. A lot of new writers I have found that I talk to, they get lost in the world building because writing stories is scary. Because when you write a story, that it presumes you're going to put it out into the world and people are going to read you and judge you terribly. And so it's easier and safer just to like build your world endlessly. And then when you actually go write the story, you're like, well, shit, I have 2,000 pages of notes. I better just put all of that into the book. Don't do that. That's a terrible idea. Stop yourself right now. My sort of guideline is only note it when it would be extraordinary to the character who's perceiving it. So when the character notes something, they say, wow, that's really out of the ordinary, that's something that's worth noting, because you're sort of, for me, I'm taking a ride through the eyes of this POV character, and so I only want to note the things that are extraordinary to that POV character and that stand out to them. Everything else, maybe I'll touch on it, but I'll sort of gloss over the details, and I won't go into the as you know, Bob, history of 1,000 years of elves and men having warfare, because nobody cares, and that's my first interaction with people is not like, hey, so how about that Revolutionary War? We should talk a lot about that, right? Founding of the history of our country, let's really go into that. That's not how people talk or do things, so only when it's extraordinary do I kind of touch on it.
Clearly none of you talk to me. That's all I can say.
Anytime the conversation starts with as you know, probably don't need it.
Yeah.
So I'm actually currently running a 5th edition campaign, and the purpose of the campaign was to help me round out a fantasy setting that I've been working on for a number of years. And it came about because, I've got these very narrow narratives set in this world, and, with stakes and agendas and all that stuff. But I kept seeing gaps, like I wanted to know what more was going on. And so in trying to gear the world building for a campaign, I had to take, these handful of, I'd set in a very metropolitan environment, so I had to take these handful of spots where I knew what was going on there, and then illustrate out and figure out what the rest of the environment was, because once I dropped my players in it, they did exactly what I wanted. I was like, okay, here are 3 prompts. What are you going to do? And they're like, we're going to do something totally else. And shit. So I had made an amusement park for them, and with lots of rides. And so as over the course of several sessions, those rides have gotten more elaborate, and those rides now interact with each other, and things way more interesting than it was before. And because I had a sense of the story behind all this in the first place, when they'll make a decision over here, like in their character backstory, they're like, I'm going to be a blade singer. And I'm like, I know what to do with that. And so, and it's made the stories a lot more interesting. But to your point, a lot of that's not going to be in the book, and I'm not farming my friends for specific narratives, right? You can. But I think there's certainly going to be a character that wasn't in the story originally. But so in that sense, it's almost like a research exercise. Because when I wrote Calamity, which is the book I have for sale in the other room, it's set in the American West, and the main character is Calamity Jane. So once I knew she was the main character, I had to go look up where was she, what was she doing. We don't know. She was a terribly unreliable narrator, so there was lots of freedom, but there was still like, Wyoming is still a place. Like, you can go there. Like, if I just suddenly started like fabricating Wyoming, to your point about like,
there's giant mountain ranges in Wyoming.
Right, they've got grizzly bears that attack schools, if I recall. So, right, so, you know, a lot of the world building happened for me. And then I got to sort of pick and play, like, well, what do I want her to go do? Especially when there's like an alien with her, like that wasn't real, so I get to have fun.
How do you know? She was unreliable.
Well, right. This is the whole thing.
This is the most historically accurate narrative that we have.
Yeah. I mean, I was a grad student at the time. I'm in like the library, and it was like nobody knows what she did between the age of 15 and 22, and I'm like, sweet. Book 1 starts. She's 15. Let's go. And right. And so, but or to sci-fi, like I do write hard sci-fi. You just have to educate yourself about it because of those assholes. Right. Yeah, like the 2 projects I have right now, I'm editing a book that's a hard sci-fi set in like an expansive type setting, and then I'm writing one that the Civil War is going on. Like, nobody cares about the details of the Civil War. Yeah, you can be fast and loose with that shit all day long.
The Civil War, I'll tell you, like, you should know what kind of fabric their pants are made out of, and they'll just actually string you up by your heels.
Those reenactors are a gold mine, I just have to say.
I went to college.
Horse Twitter. Horse ain't gun people.
I went to college like 20 minutes away from Appomattox. And like the war is still very much going on.
Yeah, the Civil War people. I have interacted with.
Yeah, but even with Calamity, I had someone come back at me and say like, a Henry rifle didn't load that way in 1867. I'm like, Wikipedia that shit. Sure did. And internet.
Like, there's no way there'd ever be a Roman coin in Okinawa. Oh yeah, 2 years later there was. I was just psychic, okay?
But that's the thing that's great with world building. Like, if you drop like Hitler riding a dinosaur into your story,
it's awesome.
Right. Always works.
Always.
People will still be like, but the Confederacy was like, oh, back up, buddy. I have dinosaur Hitler. we can now play fast and loose with all the things.
It's the rule, though. Like, I found it. It's the verisimilitude. As long as you get enough details right, they will buy Hitler riding a dinosaur.
Yeah.
It's the sound in space argument. There is no sound in space, but you buy it in Star Wars because you've already bought that there is, light sword magic. By the way, the light, you could do an endpoint. I could go on and on. But if you make the other
well,
details...
now with that kyber crystal, I mean...
Well, yeah. Mr. Kyber crystal mine's cracked.
Space wizards.
Space wizards. But no, like, I found that in world building, it is really important to get the details right. If you get the little details around the character, like they have coffee in the morning or whatever drink they drink there. They go to a school, the cars drive on the right side of the road. If you build enough of these little details, it gives you the buy-in to go, and by the way, King Arthur was a vampire. He was also ginger. That was the part that people were upset about. So I think it's important to kind of remember that fog of war around your characters, both in role-playing games and in books, is you don't have to flesh out everything, you just have to flesh out what they can see. And if you start thinking like, if I'm playing StarCraft, I can only see the base. I might not know that they're building that amazing Protoss, like all those pylons. Why didn't I see those pylons and destroy them?
Traditional pylons.
I do like
That's really well done.
I do like your point though before about like what's their job or whatever, because there's a tendency when you're world building to be like, the bad guys are going to wear black armor and they're going to be so dangerous, cool, they're going to ride around and kill everybody. It's like, cool, like what do they do for money?
Yeah. These are the questions.
And it's perfectly fine if raiding the peasants is the answer, but you still have to have the answer.
Did anybody watch Umbrella Academy? So
Yeah.
Hazel and Cha-Cha, I think, are the two greatest villains of the last 10 years, right? Because it's like so bureaucratic, and it's just like, God, they're shrinking our per diem every day. Like it's so well done. It's like the banality of their villainy is just so amazing, and this sort of bureaucratic red tape that they have to cut through.
And it gives you that buy-in, because once you can relate to it, like the world starts to make sense. You have to think, what is going to make my reader relate to it? They might not have, orcs and goblins, but they know what farming is. They know like the grudging, oh my God, they have broken this wall down and I have to build it. And that lets your reader in. So I think it's really important to not focus too much on big, but just what is important to what you're showing.
But again, like, Tolkien didn't talk about the agricultural infrastructure of Gondor. Right? Like,
I know, that is so,
right.
I wanted to know.
but wait,
Are we sure that's not the...
maybe.
It's
like
numbers from the Bible. You can say anything in there.
But like when you watch the Peter Jackson movie, or at least when I did, because I'm a nerd, like you see the really badass city, I'm like, sweet. Where do they get their food?
Yes.
Because like that's the sort of thing that in the absence of like I think extensive world building, and this is to knock on Tolkien because he like is badass, but like we don't see it. It may not be relevant, but I hope he knows the answer.
I hope so, because what is that desert tower like? How do they support 10,000 people surrounded by all this arid country? Like, are they eating each other?
There's a question that Paul Kruger asked, always asks, which is, where does the poop go?
Yeah.
Where does the poop go? Because then, once you know where the poop goes, you can then ask, who has to live near the poop and who gets to live far away from the poop?
Well, I would like to say, in response to the J.K. Rowling Twitter answering that question, I don't always need to know where the poop goes. Sometimes.
My favorite part of the fact that Hogwarts apparently didn't have indoor plumbing, like I was like, why the fuck do I not want to, like, do I want to know this? And then I was like, wait a minute, like, House Slytherin is really big on, like, not accepting newer things, which means I can now imagine a bunch of Slytherin wizards purposefully just shitting in the hallways to protest the inclusion of indoor plumbing.
Is there just one holdout still in Hogwarts? That's why the caretaker's so pissed off all the time. Mr. Shitter strikes again!
That's in there forever now.
It's actually like a Hufflepuff, just messing around.
You just know that the bloody Baron of Slytherin House is out there just squatting.
But like I think Andy Weir talked about how he wrote like his first draft of Artemis, and it didn't work because he hadn't figured out how Artemis works. So Artemis takes place on the moon, and it's a self-contained moon colony. And the audiobook is read by Rosario Dawson, and it's the best audiobook you'll ever listen to. But when he went back and figured out, like, okay, so there has to be an economy, and they have to have air, and they have to have their own power, like all this stuff. And then when he figured it out, he was like, oh shit, my story was totally wrong. This is better because this makes sense. Of course, if Andy Weir is into technobabble, right? Like, just like The Martian, everything, it's all about solving obscure science problems. That's kind of what his thing is.
And potatoes.
And he's sad about potatoes.
Yeah.
I'm sad about potatoes daily.
And sometimes knowing when to do it, when not to. I wrote a passage the other week, and it was literally one of the smart characters was like, all right, we're going to do this. The other one goes, how? And he says, look, do you want 5 minutes of technobabble, or do you just want to fucking trust I know how to do this?
Well, you can do that, right? Like, as an author, like, if you've developed enough trust from your readers, that, like, you do know what you're talking about, they'll give you that leeway. Like, you can't do it all the time, but absolutely. Like, sometimes, especially like if it's in a pre-established universe, or like in a series where like you've already built up, like, yeah, this character has the badass credentials to do all of these things, then you can do a little bit of that and then sort of put it in the background. Readers will be like, oh yeah, they could totally do that even if they don't explain how they did that. So I think that's like a trust building activity for readers and authors. Speaking of, staying on this question, but speaking of trust building activities, one of the fun things for me about DMing is building a framework and then letting my players fill in some of that with their backstory, with their character backstories. To what extent do you let players build out the world versus your own building? Oh, yeah, start reading this back. Sorry.
With me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, my players are like herding cats. I don't know if you're familiar with them, because I do remember I had 2,000 words of notes and maps and levels and things.
Players doing crazy things.
I know.
You said.
And they completely walked around it and they chased after a stupid horse, so I made one of the characters marry it, turned him into a demon. I did it before it was cool, okay? This was in the 90s. But no, I think that the problem with players, like sometimes they are great for filling in the random, unpredictable crap. I do not trust them with anything. I would say that leaving holes for them to fill is wonderful because as soon as there's a hole, they will fall in it and splat, and it's high entertaining value, and usually involves rolling for initiative. So I just keep like 15 random encounters for when they avoid all the stuff that I carefully planned for them.
Yeah, I mean, the big world stuff I keep pretty close to the chest. Like, I'm not going to let them contradict the world that's being built. But if they want to suggest something, we can see if we can work that in line. But yeah,
Horse demons.
right. But the randomness they bring to it is really what I'm looking for. And sometimes that randomness is something I'm not going to use. Right? You know, my players right now have gotten themselves, they play a group of consultant adventurers, and they've gotten themselves in bed with the local gnomish mafia. This isn't something that I'm going to use. Like, that's fine. Like,
why not? Do they charge too much?
But they've also picked a grudge with another group of consultants, and they've made it very personal and petty, and I fucking love that. So it reminds me, if anyone listens to podcasts, there's a great one called Imaginary Worlds. It's about if anyone. Right. So authors of what? But anyway, they have an episode. The host of it had never played D&D, so he, after interviewing the creators of The Expanse, because the creators of The Expanse had originally created their universe for a massive online game for a Chinese company that ended up realizing they didn't have the money for a massive game, and they gave them back the IP. So they used that as a setting and ran friends in it, and that's why there are 4 main characters in The Expanse, because 4 characters make a party. And so the author got so intrigued by this. One of the things they talk about is like, if you were writing an adventure story, your hero has to sneak into the cave to steal the treasure, and your character's a badass. Of course he sneaks into the cave and steals the treasure. But if you're playing D&D, he rolled a 1 on sneak, right?
Yeah.
Oops. And so now, like, everyone knows, and some epic, funny, awesome thing happens. And I think as authors, like, we tend to be like, my character's so cool, and this great thing's gonna happen, and I know all the things, and like, having a little random, I think, makes it more real.
Oh,
even if it's the characters wandering down, a part of the world that we hadn't anticipated or wanted them to go down, or something like them just screwing it up.
They always screw it up.
Right, I keep dropping prompts in front of them, like, here's the thing you should do. Remember the Revenant that was trying to kill the lady who runs the bank? And they're like,
get fish
and they keep going like, Wishspell's really far away, we don't want to deal with the Revenant. What about this thing over here with the gnomes? And I'm like, fuck, yeah,
Lord Helms.
Yep. Ginger no.
Ginger.
Sorry, I read your brain again. Again.
So I don't run a specific D&D campaign, but I do. So one of the series I read, Burning Online, is takes place in this sort of, it's a sci-fi fantasy mashup. Takes place about 50 years in the future, and but it's a big, giant, expanded universe. And so I have a number of different authors that also write their own standalone series, but set inside the same universe. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of coordination. And because they're exploring different parts of the world. And I've tried to be pretty vague in the main series about specific areas and specific things because I like the creativity that other people bring to my stories. Because as good as I am at being a storyteller, and I am a badass, there are a lot of other good storytellers who bring a lot of really good stuff to the table. And so it's always fun, like, oh man, that's a quest line that I never would have thought of exploring, or that's a character that I never would have thought of exploring. Or my books tend to be really plot-driven, but some of the authors that I work with are really character-driven storytellers, and so they bring really cool slice-of-life stuff to the story that I never would have thought of. So I think that the ingenuity and creativity of other people, and including them in your world building, it can really create a richer, more interesting world. Because we're sort of, as just human beings, we're locked in to sort of sort of a primary way that we view things and a lens that we view the world and the way that we think about things. And I think that's why D&D is so fun and cooperative storytelling is so fun, is because you are able to break out of yourself a little bit. That's why I like doing co-author projects, because the best part is riffing with somebody else. I'm like, oh, that's a cool idea. Oh, but what about this? And you can bounce ideas off each other, and you end up in this place that is wildly different than where you started, that's so much cooler for it. One other thing, sort of on your point, so I just wrote a series with a buddy of mine, Dakota. It's called Bibliomancer. And I'm a pretty heavy outliner, but one of the things that was really fun that I did this time is when I got to like crucial plot elements, I actually rolled d20s to determine whether or not he was going to succeed in a given course of action, and oftentimes he didn't. And so it's like, oh shit, he just rolled a 1 on here, and so now I have to come up with like, this has failed miserably. What would happen now? And so it kind of removes that element of like the Mary Sue, super badass, good at everything, never fails, always excels, natural 20s every single time. So I think that like introducing some of that, people make mistakes and things go wrong and mistakes happen. I think that can create sort of fun storytelling elements when you're working in your story. So that's the thing that I like to do too.
Let's see, I guess the way characters influence the world. As a DM, fair to minimal. I don't have a lot of players to take me up on it anymore, but if they work in a backstory, I'll check it with them. And often, if there's something that can be used as a hook for that character, then that's fun. I'll sprinkle that in throughout the main adventure, give them something to kind of tease out. It adds a little bit of customization, but that's generally as much as it goes into, because the quest is informed by the party's collective decisions, and that can't really be shaped around one player without sacrificing the enjoyment of the party as a whole. Now, when it comes to writing, I'm kind of weirdly more character-driven. So, very brief outline. The way I outline is a thing I call checkpoint outlining. I have my start, I have my end, and I know the key events that have to happen and the order in which they must happen for this to make sense. And that's true for a book, and that's true for a series. So I generally always know my checkpoints when I'm starting out. Now sometimes they'll shift a little and they'll change, but the shape is fairly consistent. Now once I have that, I like to go between the checkpoints, and that is where basically I just let the characters drive. Whatever makes the most character sense to get here to here tends to be the way I write it. And so that's the fun of me, is I know the shape of the story, but I don't always know the details, and I don't know the fun way it's going to play out. It's a mix of scripting and improv, is sort of the way I describe it. So in that context, I would say I'm fairly heavy on letting the characters shape the world, because it all sort of flows from them. Whatever makes the most sense for their world is probably going to come from their perspective.
And they don't behave. They won't die when I tell them to. It's very dramatic. Now I have a 6-book trilogy.
Right, or you put them up against a big bad, and the big bad falls in 2 turns, and you're like, whoa. That was supposed
or
to
the
be
big
more.
bad loses a seduction roll, and that was a whole campaign of, they're marrying each other? Like, I have to plan a wedding for my characters with my villain? So, it does happen.
Or the wrong person grabs an ass.
Oh, you say wrong. I say most entertaining.
Or someone ends up in someone else's body.
No joke though, I think actually like Klaus the Chosen One was one of the best.
If you kept rolling, you legit could not just break that.
No, I couldn't.
And you're lifting
You
ass.
have the most random, really, like, unstoppable luck, or that was another one.
Bjork had a crisis himself after that. And he saw what it led to, and he was okay.
I mean, I'd rather my players try to break my universe than my readers go like, this universe is broken. Like, I'd rather test it out ahead of time. And this is why I think DMs make the worst players also. Because people, we know what it feels like when your player fucks with your world. So then when it's our turn, we're gonna fuck with your world. Like, I'm in a Force and Destiny campaign right now, and I lost a significant role, and I was like, all right, well, I guess dark side is the way shit's gonna go. And what? Seems to me it's the way for me to get stuff done, and it was the most effective and productive session I've had.
You fell, didn't you?
I haven't fallen low enough for it to matter yet.
You tried. I believe in you.
Right?
I believe in you.
Okay.
Yes.
So, next question.
Sure.
This time we're going to start down with Drew. So we've talked about fleshing things out. We've talked about how you outbuild and how you jump from thing to thing and keep it all connected. One of the most important things about world building, though, is consistency, internal consistency. And the more, the bigger things get, the harder that is. How do you focus? How do you keep your focus and keep things consistent so that you're not losing that sort of core tenet or core structure that makes that buy-in work?
Okay, so part of it is a lot of just going back and rereading my material whenever you start on a project. I try to be consistent. The consistent part of it is hiring a great editing team, having one of the beta readers who call me when I fuck that up. But part of it is my strategy tends to be, we talked about world building. I always like to go reality adjacent. I use real estates in big cities. And that tends to mirror how my worlds work. It defaults to assumed reality until I have specific points where I, put a little spike in and I'm like, oh no, wait, that's not the way that this works. And so, with the Fred books, it's the secret parahuman treaty thing and sort of the way the bureaucracy fell out from that. But otherwise, I just have to keep track of normal worlds. And so that tends to be the easiest for me. And also, because of the style, I like reality adjacent. I like our world, but a little bit off. That tends to be where my favorite stories live. And so that works. Also, I use a site called Trello. They make these great note card displays. So it's really easy for every character. You can have big bullet points of really important shit you can't fuck up. And then you can have more generic stuff. It's a free site and it's super useful if that's the way your brain organizes.
Yeah, I think that urban fantasy, because I wrote urban fantasy for a long time, and I think that urban fantasy is way easier to keep track of because you're right, there's so many touchstones that people are already familiar with and that you yourself are familiar with. Because if it's kind of Chicago, you kind of know what that looks like and you kind of know what the weather is. And so it's easy to sort of go back and sort of establish those touchstones. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier with in terms of internal consistency is it's easier to get the small details right on something that actually exists, right? You can get the small details right on down and how cars work and how guns work. And you can sort of capture those things, and so that gives you a lot of internal consistency that creates trust from your readers. With the more epic fantasy and high fantasy stuff, it's a lot harder. It's because it's an entirely a second world fantasy where nothing is the same, everything is different, language is different, all of it's different. And so it does take a lot of time, and keeping those details consistent is really important. You can kind of do whatever you want as an author, but once you make a thing, it's got to stay a thing. And there's nothing that will, in my experience, that will lose you readers faster than to say, hey, this is a hard and fast rule and this is how that works, and then you write yourself into a corner and you have to break that rule. Readers will be mad at you, and they will stop reading your books. And so if you say, hey, no, this is how magic works, this is how it has to be. In terms of keeping it all consistent, I've really grown as an author. I still do only one or two point of view characters, because I think that the more you branch out, the harder it gets. At some point, I want to write a big epic fantasy, but I don't think that I'm a good enough writer yet to do that. I think that even really good writers struggle with that. I think there's a reason why George R. R. Martin hasn't finished Game of Thrones, and it's because he's got fucking 30 viewpoint characters, right? How the fuck are you going to keep track of 30 viewpoint characters that are all over this crazy continent?
Spreadsheets.
So
Kill him.
It's I can't remember what this person's supposed to do, so I better just murder them. I guess that's a viable solution. I don't know, but it does take a lot of work, especially working with this big expanded universe with all of these different authors. That's been kind of a big headache. But we have a really good team of people. I have super enthusiastic beta readers who know more about my books than I know about my books, and they're like, "You're wrong about that, James. That's not how that works. You said that in book 2." I'm like, "Shit, it'd been so cool if it did work that way, though." And I have to go back and I have to fix things. So I think as you get bigger and as your books expand, rereading them a lot, revisiting the material a lot, and finding good people to sort of check you on things goes a long way toward making sure that your books stay consistent.
I think it's the argument against exposition, right? The needless telling people that 1,000 years ago such and such happened. If your character doesn't know that, then, and if it's not relevant to what's happening right now, then you probably don't need to talk about it. And then when you get to book 2 or 3, and you're like, ooh, I want to change something that happens in the past, well, you haven't screwed up with your continuity. Since no one knew anyway. Like, you knew, you have to adjust stuff, but you have the freedom to do that. And I think that works in both an RPG and a novel writing situation as well. Like, as a, for my campaign that I'm doing right now, I made them a source book. I really made it for me to flesh stuff out. But as the game's gone on, that source book has changed or whatever, but it doesn't matter because I'm changing stuff that didn't affect gameplay, right? So now it's like, by the way, guys, just so you know, the city's half the size that it was last week. Just because it was too big.
Thanos did it?
Huh?
Thanos did it?
No, same number of people, it's geography. But it didn't matter. It didn't affect the game, but it helped me. So I think I'll echo all the things you guys are saying, but I think it's the freedom of a character perspective as opposed to the omniscient perspective is, if they don't know it, then we don't know it.
Yeah.
I just fill my stories with a lot of liars, so if I have to contradict myself, it's like, oh no, don't you understand? They were unreliable all along.
Unreliable narrator is super useful.
Oh, it is so useful.
Yeah.
I highly recommend it. Just have a scumbag who lies, who can be bribed
You mean like
occasionally.
Obi-Wan Kenobi?
Yeah. Basically. From a certain point of view.
The rule is if it's in dialogue tags,
Yes.
Fucking yeah.
That's why I have dialogue, tag, exposition.
people can be wrong. People can be telling the absolute truth and be completely fucking wrong.
And that's the beauty of it. And I think that, as I playing with liars and scumbags really helps. Also, as I you have to have good people, beta readers, editors. I do keep a series Bible whenever I'm writing a series. Mostly it's, oh crap, what eye color did this guy have? Oh wait, he's got green eyes. He's the love interest. What can I say? It's just a trope at this point. But I think that keeping good, consistent notes in a format that you like and that's easily accessible. It doesn't matter if you write a big, long, 30-page Bible. It's just writing another book. Bullet points. I use spreadsheets, little note cards. Something that's easy to reference, and usually when I'm writing, I have the bullet points of, please do not screw up the friggin' eye color, Rachel. And I have named stuff that. It really helps. And when I'm doing, when I used to DM, I made a little handbook. It was so cute. It had a picture from one of the characters on it. But don't be afraid to just take notes. I'm a pantser when I write, but I have the biggest bullet points of, okay, someone's gonna die again. And then half the time I have ended up not doing it anyway. So
I will say from a consistency perspective, to your point about historical adjacent to urban fantasy and stuff, historical inspired is also super helpful. If you look at Game of Thrones, there's a lot of War of the Roses in Game of Thrones, right? Even down to the names, right? So yeah, and so and it's super helpful. One, because just like role-playing games, it introduces randomness. Because history is a really badass soap opera that very rarely went from A to Z directly, right? So using historical inspiration, be it a place or a person or whatever, can really help with consistency. Because then even so one of my characters is Calamity Jane. That's an easy one, but I often pull people and I'll change the names and use part of the real person or an amalgamation of real people or a real city or a real place or whatever to generate the scenario. And sometimes I have to worry if I'm using a real name and screwing with the person
yeah, they don't like it.
Yeah, whatever.
Don't make King Arthur a ginger. No.
Right.
King Arthur Ginger Vampire would be a pretty good book test.
That actually is in my book. I actually did that one.
Excellent.
But it makes it easier to keep track because then you could be well, I wonder what the real person did. And then if you're anchoring off a real inspiration, then it's like a note that was already taken for you.
Yes, it is lovely. Especially when you have I like to take real events and you you think you know what happened, but oh wait, Lancelot was the nice guy and he was oh no, crap, he's a werewolf now. Shit. Nobody was nice. And they all killed each other. But, in a different way.
Also, real quick, because you made such a good point about
I did.
That you did.
Oh, you
Because I cannot tell you that your point about how good it is not to use needless exposition.
Yeah.
There are so many things where I could go back and I could fix something, that I'm like, man, that would have been a real problem if I would have put that into book one. And because I was smart enough to just shut my stupid mouth and not include that in book one, because it wouldn't really have added anything to the story except a little bit of extraneous world building. Now I can just scrap that and I can do something much cooler that's going to take the story in a much better direction. And so, like, seriously, if it doesn't need to be said, really consider whether or not it should be in there at all, because it can come back and bite you in the ass in the most painful ways.
Oh, yeah.
If it's not there, you can just roll with it and you can change things, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility with your series and direction. So.
I'll take the counterpoint on that. That yes, don't do it if it's not necessary, but if you're doing this world building, you have this knowledge base of where everything's going. Drop a little hint, drop a foreshadow in book one, in book two. Like, if it doesn't have to be specific, just the shape of the mystery you're going to touch on.
Oh, yeah, because the readers have to care, so they have to have context.
They have to care, and it's the difference between if this pops in at book 3 versus if it's paying off a few weird cryptic shits in book 1, it feels so much more satisfying as a reader. It's like, I remember that.
It's like,
Versus, oh, this is just coming out of nowhere.
I knew it
And that's a good point too, because it makes you look way smarter as an author. Like, you can just drop these little cryptic things and you're like, you've been setting that up since book 1, you're so smart and thoughtful. And I'm like, yeah. Throwaway line that I remembered in book 4 and I brought back in. Like,
We always meant it.
yeah, that was totally been just playing the whole time.
Unless it sucked, then it was an accident, there's been any.
So, I got another one more question, and then I think we'll open it up to audience questions. So, when determining details, when like getting into that granular stuff, what details as authors are most important to you personally? And start with.
What's important
I'm
is
gonna start. Jay, you only got 4 minutes, right? You only got 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. So. Oh, okay, gotcha. Well,
it's all important.
it's all important. That's fair. All right. So, anyone in the audience have questions? Great.
Nobody else does.
Really?
Yeah.
You guys have discussed a lot about building out the world on a perspective basis. What about building the actual landscape for your fantasy world? Drew, you mentioned that using real world locations, that's great. But when addressing a world that doesn't actually exist, how do you handle that? How do you build that out?
Video games.
Well,
I pick things that are going to be. I pick what's going to be the same, and I use that as a grounding point. Because like in the Drifting Lands, everything is on floating islands in an endless sky. Okay, fine. But people still need water. People still need to take a crap. People still, and you think about how the different things will inform things that seem normal to people, and then kind of make that a linchpin of perspective.
I think character perspective can help a lot on this, because we're used to a world where like maps are a big deal. We use them all the time and they're accurate. That's a really modern thing. So if you're writing in a fantasy setting or working in a fantasy setting, like people didn't have a good sense of geography, and maps were typically very abstract. Like if you look at maps of the world in the Middle Ages, like there are always some attempts to make Jerusalem the middle of the world, right? European maps anyway. And so if you look at like the Witcher novels, there is no map of that world. Like there are in the video games, and there are fan attempts to make the maps, but the author has never presented a map because Geralt doesn't have one. Like he doesn't use one; he just knows where to go. And to some degree, that comes back to that's unnecessary exposition that keeps the world loose for the author, right? Like as soon as that map exists, now I the reader can look at that map and be like, all these places must be important at some point. So on a small scale, mapping I think is perfectly valid. The village, the town, the city.
Minecraft helps. You can just build out your
Right. And there are lots of great tools. There's one called OpenStreet, which basically allows you just to rip off Earth. And you can just I really like this part of Oregon, and I really like this part of Italy, and now I have my own place. And because people tend to be pretty crap at drawing geography. Like Tolkien was. Oh my God! Yes, that's not how Earth
There are
works.
always horseshoe mountain ranges around evil layers. It's a law.
Yeah, but I would just sort of challenge I have no problem with maps. I make maps. but like you have to prove that you need the map before the map gets made. Better like have the character, if you're doing a campaign, let the characters make their own damn map. Like while you're going, it's like, then you travel 50 leagues to whatever, and they're like, what, where? Because they shouldn't know where they are.
Yeah.
God help me if I let Klaus rip your trying.
All right, I think we're good for more, like, one or two more questions. Yes, in the back.
Alright, so the minor world building stuff, like the stuff that isn't strictly necessary, like certain characters that are background characters that are played, and the little things that you worked in that, again, not necessary, but like conversations that criminals are having about how much they hate this person while they're sitting in a car scoping out a target. How, like, do you have a rule of how much of the little slice of life kind of stuff you actually work in the world building?
As much as people really talk about in real life.
I try to work in as much as I can. Like, to me, the mundane within magic is my favorite, like, thing to find comedy. And so, yeah, if I can find a natural way of, like, someone complaining about, like, a lunch, and it's like, oh, it's like I got fucking food poisoning because of Jim, the son of a bitch that we're here to kill. But, like, if I'm going to go that route, I'm going to tie it into something human. Like, it's going to be, you know, a pettiness or an embarrassment or something ridiculous that's the kind of stupid shit people do complain about relentlessly. And you're like, I know,
Traffic.
man, I know you got food poisoning with Jim and you blame him for crapping your pants. I know that.
I 100% agree that the mundane details make the world a lot more real. There are actually a lot of great resources. I follow a bunch of people on Instagram actually that will put up like, here's a random generator for stalls at a market. Here's a random generator for the accent you should affect when you're talking as a character. And as the DM, they can be like, we're in a tavern, let's buy everyone a drink. And I'm like, cool. Here's the toast they yell, or whatever. And then my players have picked up on one of those randomized toasts. But like, it's not something that's worth. I don't know that I even could have anticipated the need. But like, you can accumulate some of these resources to make life easier. And there's actually these really old books from the 80s, by a company called Central Casting. And if anyone uses the Trove to get their D&D or their game resources for free, which you shouldn't do, but if you go to the Trove, the Central Casting books will tell you, like, they'll be like, here's a total way to randomize a sci-fi or a fantasy or a modern character or even a dungeon. And it's time intensive, but if you want to have like a rando character walk in, you could like spend 40 minutes with these books and like roll some dice and you'll have like an extremely elaborate character that is probably something you would have come up with on your own, which is why
I live with slice of life. I basically drew, which is scary, sitting next to each other. But no, I will totally divest 3 or 4 pages on people bitching about food or traffic, usually as a breather. Like in writing, it helps you get into the world. I kind of use it as a pause, and then boom, it'll go really fast. Because we're doing a lot of action, nobody's going to be talking about the weather unless it's pertinent to the lightning creature striking you.
That's an extremely good point. The pacing of
it's
this sort of thing
very
is
good as
incredibly, like, you have to know when.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah, I usually, because I tend to write more plot-driven stories, and so I think that those little mundane details, when you can slip them into conversations, and again, the pacing is important, so you don't want to slip it into the middle of an action scene, because that would be a dumb place for people to be talking about Jim.
Unless you're doing comedy.
Unless you're doing comedy. But I think that they round out the characters and they give them just the feeling of a little bit more depth. I think that it's kind of a shorthand to create characters that feel more three-dimensional when you talk about things that happened outside of the context of this particular story, but then never really elaborate on them. Readers, they take that and they make a connection and say, oh, this character has a life outside of this story, and so it sort of fleshes them out and makes them feel more like a real person. So that's a great trick that you can also do for secondary characters that don't get as much screen time, is you can kind of put in a little bit more of that for them, because it kind of instantaneously fleshes them out in a way that the reader will say, oh, this is not a one-dimensional, plot character that's just here to deliver some exposition. They have a life outside of the story. So I think that's a really good tool to flesh out characters, especially minor ones.
And relationships.
Yeah.
Shorthand for relationships.
I will say that sort of mundane stuff too in a game setting is a great way to build, or a way to set up tension or set up a surprise. Because I've seen players get all into this mundane crap at a tavern, or like with the Kenku housekeeper, or whatever, and like they're just screwing around with them, and it's fun in the moment. It wouldn't be fun in a book, I don't think, some of these situations, but they're fun in the game, and then you drop a big thing on them. And then it's, because that's how life works, right? Like you're having a nice dinner with people, and then you get a bad call, right? Or something, you're having a good day at work, and then something shitty happens. And so you can use those mundane details to like make things bad for your players, which is great.
Okay, so I think we're running up against time here.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to close this. If anyone wants to give a last.
I'll shout out the No Shit I Really Did That panel starting in 5 minutes.
They're awesome.
With Ian Kaplan, James Hunter, just say it again.
All right.
Rick Terry, Andrea Judy, and Robert Heaven. So if you've got a good seat, stay playing it. It's going to be a fun one.